The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, heavy and unrelenting. It was the kind of hush that came not from peace, but from tension, a breath held collectively by everyone in the room. The large wooden doors at the back creaked open, and all heads turned toward the small figure stepping inside. Emma Walker, just 5 years old, hesitated for a brief moment before walking forward. Her tiny hand clutched tightly to the leash of Bella, a golden Labrador retriever whose smooth fur bore a deep, jagged scar along her side. Emma was the only witness in the case that had gripped San Francisco for weeks. 2 weeks ago, a man had tried to abduct her from a park in broad daylight. A good Samaritan had intervened, scaring the suspect away, but Emma had seen his face. If she could speak, if she could point him out, he would never walk free again. But she hadn't spoken a word since that day. From the judge's bench, Harold Whitman watched her closely. He was a man who had spent decades on the bench, had seen every trick defense lawyers could pull, every type of fear that could keep witnesses from speaking. But this was different. This was not hesitation or forgetfulness. This was something deeper. The defendant, David Kent, sat rigid at the defense table, his hands folded, his expression calm. Too calm. To the jury, he looked like an average man, tidy, composed, nothing menacing about him. But Judge Whitman had seen men like him before. A few feet away, Laura Walker, Emma's mother, sat stiffly in the front row, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her daughter was strong, stronger than anyone realized, but she knew how much this moment was asking of her. Prosecutor Jenna Reynolds stepped forward, keeping her voice soft. "Emma, sweetheart, do you remember me?" Emma gave no sign that she had heard her. Her green eyes remained fixed downward, her fingers gripping Bella's leash tighter. The jury shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. The defense attorney, Michael Hartman, let out a slow breath, a flicker of a smirk touching his lips. A silent witness was no witness at all. Judge Whitman studied the girl's small, fragile frame. He had seen it before, children locked away in themselves after trauma, their voices stolen by something larger than words could explain. He had also seen how powerful silence could be. Then, something happened. Emma's small fingers twitched, making a barely noticeable motion, a signal. It was so subtle that only two beings in the room noticed it, Judge Whitman and Bella. Bella's reaction was instant. The Labrador's ears pricked forward, her muscles tensed, and a low growl rumbled from deep in her chest. It was not a fearful sound. It was a sound of recognition. Of warning. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. People turned their heads, whispers filling the space. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The dog is reacting to the tension in the room." Judge Whitman ignored him. His gaze remained locked on Bella, and more importantly, on Emma. Something was happening. Something important. Judge Whitman brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he said, his voice even but firm. He had spent a lifetime trusting the law. But now, for the first time in his career, he was about to put his faith in something else. A child's silence. And a dog's instincts. 2 weeks earlier, the sun was bright over Golden Gate Park, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jacarandas. It was one of those rare perfect San Francisco afternoons, warm but not stifling, the sky crisp and cloudless. Emma Walker twirled in the sunlight, her pink dress flaring as she spun in the grass. Her laughter, high and sweet, carried on the wind. A few feet away, her mother, Laura, sat on a bench, smiling as she watched her daughter play. It had been a long week, and this was meant to be a quiet day of peace. Then her phone rang. Laura hesitated before answering. Her sister, calling from Los Angeles. Just a quick conversation. A minute at most. It took less than 4 minutes for everything to change. When Laura turned back, Emma was gone. Her stomach clenched, a primal fear gripping her instantly. She shot to her feet, scanning the park, her breath catching. Then she saw them. A black sedan idled near the curb, its back door cracked open. A man crouched beside Emma, speaking softly. His face was calm, friendly even, but Laura knew, she knew. Her heart pounded as she took a breath and shouted her daughter's name. Emma flinched. The man's expression flickered, just for a second, but Laura caught it. A tightening of the jaw. A calculation. And then, he grabbed her. Laura's world slowed to a terrifying crawl. Across the street, Margaret Stevens, an elderly woman out for her afternoon walk, saw it happen. Her sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" The man hesitated. His grip loosened, just enough. Emma ripped away from him and ran. Laura sprinted across the grass, arms outstretched. By the time she reached her daughter, the sedan was already speeding away, leaving a trail of burnt rubber. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trembling. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. And she didn't say a word. The silence began that day. At first, Laura assumed it was shock, something a warm bath and bedtime stories could fix. But the days stretched on. Emma stopped laughing. She stopped playing. She refused to leave the house. She barely ate. When Laura tried to talk to her, Emma only clutched her stuffed rabbit and turned away. The nightmares came next. They weren't the kind with loud screams, no, they were worse. Laura would wake in the dead of night to find Emma thrashing in her bed, gasping for breath, like she was drowning in something unseen. But she never made a sound. The pediatrician called it selective mutism, a trauma response. "She's not choosing to be silent," the doctor explained gently. "Her body is choosing for her." Laura tried everything. Therapy. Storybooks. Her favorite movies. Nothing worked. Her daughter was slipping away, locked in a world of fear that Laura couldn't reach. Until she found Bella. Bella was never supposed to be theirs. She was a retired service dog, once trained in search and rescue. After an injury ended her career, she had been deemed unfit for duty. Laura wasn't sure why she thought a dog might help, but she was desperate. The day they arrived at the rehabilitation center, Emma refused to step inside. She stood frozen in the parking lot, eyes wide, gripping her mother's hand with small, bone-white fingers. Laura was about to turn back when she noticed something. Across the yard, Bella sat watching them. The Labrador was still, calm. She didn't bound toward Emma. She waited. For a long moment, Emma stared back at her. Then, slowly, Emma took a step forward. Another. Then another. Until she stood just a few feet away. Laura held her breath. Emma lifted her trembling hand. And for the first time since the attack, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against Bella's fur. The connection was made. Laura felt tears burn behind her eyes as she whispered, "Oh, sweetheart." Emma gripped the dog's fur tighter, burying her face against her neck. And for the first time in weeks, her small body stopped shaking. Laura met the trainer's gaze. "We'll take her." That was how Bella became Emma's voice. She didn't need words. She just needed Bella. At first, Bella was just a presence, a quiet shadow following Emma through the house, padding softly behind her small footsteps. The Labrador never forced herself into Emma's space. She didn't demand attention like most dogs might. Instead, she simply waited. And in that waiting, something began to change. One evening, as the sun cast a golden glow through the bay windows, Emma sat curled up in the corner of the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Bella lay on the floor nearby, her head resting on her front paws. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. Then, Emma did something unexpected. Without a word, she slipped off the couch and onto the rug beside Bella. Her small fingers traced the scar along the dog's side, feeling the raised skin beneath her touch. Bella didn't move. She only watched Emma, her deep brown eyes steady and patient. A long moment passed. Then, so soft it was almost swallowed by the quiet, Emma whispered, "Does it still hurt?" Laura, watching from the kitchen, froze. She had not heard her daughter's voice in 2 weeks. She set the plate she was holding onto the counter and turned, hardly daring to breathe. Bella didn't react. She just let Emma's fingers brush against the scar, her tail giving one slow wag. Emma hesitated. Then she whispered again, a little louder this time. "You don't talk either." Bella blinked, her ears twitching. Another long pause. Then Emma, as if coming to some silent understanding, buried her face in the dog's fur. For the first time in weeks, Laura saw her daughter's small shoulders relax. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears burning behind her eyes. Bella wasn't just a dog. She was Emma's voice. From that day forward, Emma and Bella became inseparable. At night, when the nightmares came, silent, suffocating things that left Emma thrashing in her bed, it was Bella who nudged her awake. The dog would curl beside her, letting Emma press her face into warm fur, letting her know she wasn't alone. During the day, Bella followed her through every shadowed hallway, every cautious step onto the front porch. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Emma began to return to the world. She still didn't speak much. But she didn't need to. Because Bella understood. And for the first time since the attack, Emma wasn't afraid to be heard. Then came the day when Laura received the call. "Mrs. Walker," the prosecutor's voice came through the phone, calm but firm. "We need Emma to testify." Laura gripped the kitchen counter, her stomach twisting. "I don't know if she can," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's just a little girl." "I understand," the prosecutor said gently. "But she's also the only witness. Without her, we may not be able to convict David Kentucky." A silence stretched between them. Laura felt the weight of it. The weight of justice. The weight of her daughter's fear. She turned and looked toward the living room, where Emma sat on the floor beside Bella, running her small fingers through the dog's golden fur. Laura swallowed. Then, softly, she asked, "Can Bella come with her?" The prosecutor hesitated. Support animals aren't always permitted in court. But Laura already knew. Without Bella, Emma wouldn't make it to the witness stand. She wouldn't make it through the doors. She wouldn't make it at all. "Then you'll have to find a way," Laura said firmly. "Because Emma doesn't speak without her." 3 days later, a judge granted special permission for Bella to sit beside Emma in the courtroom. And just like that, the trial that would change everything began. The air inside the San Francisco County Courthouse was thick with anticipation. The room was packed, reporters lined the back, their pens poised, while spectators whispered behind cupped hands. At the center of it all sat David Kent, his face unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath the table. He had spent the last 2 weeks maintaining his composure, a picture of calm confidence. But today, something was different. Today, Emma Walker would take the stand. And she wouldn't be alone. The bailiff's voice rang through the chamber. "All rise." Judge Harold Whitman entered, his robe flowing behind him. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. His gaze lingered for just a moment longer on the small girl walking toward the witness stand. Emma. Her mother walked beside her, a protective hand on her back, but it was Bella who guided her forward. The Labrador walked in perfect step, her ears pricked forward, her leash held loosely in Emma's trembling hands. The sight of the dog sparked murmurs from the jury box. Some looked uncertain, others intrigued. At the defense table, Michael Hartman, Kent's attorney, was already on his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. The presence of a large dog in this courtroom is highly prejudicial. It will create undue sympathy for the witness and unfairly sway the jury against my client." Jenna Reynolds, the prosecutor, was ready. "Your Honor, Emma Walker is 5 years old. She has been diagnosed with selective mutism due to trauma caused by the defendant's actions. Bella is a certified therapy animal, medically approved to assist her. Without Bella, Emma cannot communicate at all." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, studying Emma. The girl had stopped at the base of the witness stand. She wasn't looking at the judge, or the attorneys, or even the jury. She was looking at David, Kentucky. And she wasn't moving. Bella whined softly, pressing against Emma's side. Judge Whitman tapped his gavel once. "The dog stays." A flicker of irritation crossed Hartman's face, but he sat back down. Kent's expression remained unchanged. Emma took a slow step forward. Then another. And another. She climbed into the oversized chair, her small hands tightening on Bella's leash as the dog settled at her feet. Judge Whitman leaned forward. "Miss Walker, do you understand why you're here today?" Emma didn't respond. A silence stretched through the room. A bead of sweat rolled down Hartman's temple. He knew the case against Kent was weak without Emma's testimony. If she remained silent, they would win. Jenna spoke softly. "Emma, can you tell us who was with you in the park that day?" "Nothing." Emma's fingers twitched. Then, the smallest movement. She raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. Directly at David, Kentucky. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kent stiffened. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he didn't react. Jenna's voice was steady. "Emma, did this man try to take you?" Again, silence. Emma's free hand moved, making a tiny signal. A signal only Bella understood. The Labrador's ears shot forward. Her body tensed. Then came the sound that shattered the room. A deep, low growl. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it was unmistakable. It was a warning. A recognition. A truth that could not be ignored. The reaction sent a shockwave through the jury. The spectators stirred, whispering rapidly. Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed. He had seen therapy dogs before. He had never seen one react like this. Michael Hartman shot up. "Objection. This is pure theatrics. A dog's behavior cannot be used as evidence." Overruled. The gavel struck the wood. Kent shifted in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uncomfortable. Judge Whitman turned to Jenna. "Proceed." But Jenna wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at Emma. More specifically, at Bella. Because the dog had not stopped watching Kent. Her muscles were tight, her nostrils flared. It was the same reaction she had the first time she saw him. And that meant something. Jenna's mind worked quickly. She turned and whispered something to her co-counsel. A moment later, an officer quietly left the courtroom. Hartman scowled. "What's going on?" Jenna smiled. "We're about to find out." The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on. Every eye was fixed on Bella, the Labrador retriever who had just growled, a quiet but unmistakable reaction, at David, Kentucky. Judge Harold Whitman sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He had always believed that evidence should be concrete, factual, something that could be measured and presented in black and white. But this was something different. This was instinct. An instinct, especially in a dog trained for service, was rarely wrong. Across the room, Jenna Reynolds, the prosecutor, remained standing, her hands clasped before her. She knew that whatever just happened had shifted the trial, even if the defense wouldn't admit it yet. At the defense table, Michael Hartman was already whispering to his client. Kent's jaw was tight, his hands clasped together so hard his knuckles turned white. He had not expected this. No one had. But Jenna had an idea. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I request a brief recess. There is a matter I believe is relevant to this trial that needs to be investigated immediately." Hartman stood up sharply. "Objection. The prosecution is clearly trying to buy time. What new evidence could possibly have come up in the last 10 minutes? Jenna turned toward him. "Evidence that your client might be far more dangerous than we previously thought." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitman tapped his gavel once, silencing the room. Then he looked at Jenna. "Explain." Jenna turned slightly, her eyes moving between Emma and Bella. "Your Honor," she began, choosing her words carefully, "this dog was not chosen randomly. Bella is a retired search and rescue animal with a history in law enforcement. She was trained to identify danger, to recognize scents, and most importantly, she let the words settle before she spoke again. To remember people." A heavier silence filled the room. Judge Whitman's gaze darkened. "Are you suggesting the dog has encountered the defendant before?" Jenna's voice was firm. "I don't know yet. But I intend to find out." Just then, the courtroom doors opened. The officer who had quietly slipped out earlier had returned. He moved quickly, handing Jenna a folder. She flipped it open, scanning its contents. Then, her expression changed. A slow, measured look crossed her face before she turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that this trial be delayed by 24 hours. Hartman snapped. "Absolutely not. This is ridiculous. You can't halt a trial based on a dog's reaction." But Jenna didn't look at him. She looked straight at Kent. And for the first time since the trial began, he looked nervous. "Your Honor," she said again, "we've just located a direct connection between David Kent and Bella." Judge Whitman's brows lifted. Jenna turned to the courtroom. 3 years ago, in Sacramento, Bella was assigned to a missing child case. The crowd stilled. An 8-year-old girl named Sophie Calloway disappeared from her front yard, Jenna continued. Bella was one of the search dogs brought in. She tracked Sophie's scent from her house to a construction site 5 miles away. A breathless pause. Sophie was never found. Murmurs erupted. Judge Whitman lifted a hand, silencing the courtroom. "Miss Reynolds," he said carefully, "are you telling me that Bella, the same dog in this courtroom, tracked a missing girl to a crime scene years ago? And now she's reacting to the defendant today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Jenna's voice was cold. "And I'd like to know why." At the defense table, Kent wasn't breathing. His lawyer was speaking to him in low, urgent tones, but for the first time, Kent looked rattled. The calm mask was slipping. Because Bella remembered him. She knew. And now, so did everyone else. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly. Then he brought down his gavel. This court is adjourned for 24 hours. The prosecution will present its findings tomorrow morning." With that, the room exploded into whispers as Kent lowered his head, his fingers clenching against the table. Because his past was no longer buried. And a dog had just uncovered it. The next morning, San Francisco County Courthouse was a different place. The air crackled with tension, a weight settling over the room like an oncoming storm. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, reporters crammed along the back wall, their cameras clicking, their pens moving feverishly. Because today, everything was about to change. Judge Harold Whitman sat in his high-backed chair, his hands steepled in front of him. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the courtroom, pausing briefly on David Kent, who sat stiffly at the defense table. Kent's once composed demeanor was gone. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, a nervous tick that hadn't been there before. His lawyer, Michael Hartman, leaned toward him, whispering in urgent tones, but Kent did not respond. Something had shaken him. And everyone in the room knew what it was. Bella. The Labrador retriever lay calmly at Emma Walker's feet, her head resting on her paws. From the outside, she looked completely at ease. But anyone who had watched the trial yesterday knew the truth. Bella had recognized Kent. And now, the prosecution was ready to prove why. Jenna Reynolds, the lead prosecutor, stood slowly, a file clasped in her hands. "Your Honor," she began, her voice even but filled with purpose, "we have conducted a thorough investigation following yesterday's discovery. What we found is deeply troubling." Judge Whitman nodded once. "Proceed." Jenna took a breath. 2 years ago, an 8-year-old girl named Sophie Calloway vanished from her front yard in Sacramento. Bella was part of the K-9 unit brought in to search for her. A hush fell over the room. Jenna's voice never wavered. Bella tracked Sophie's scent to an abandoned construction site. The search ended there. No body was found, no suspect was identified. She let the words settle. Until now. She turned toward the defense table. "David Kent," she said, "owned that construction site." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Kent's jaw tightened, his shoulders rigid. His attorney stood abruptly. "Objection. This is pure speculation. There is no direct link between my client and this alleged incident." Jenna did not blink. "Your Honor, yesterday Bella reacted to Mr. Kent in a way that suggests recognition. That reaction was not random. This morning, forensic teams returned to the old construction site." She reached into her file and withdrew a photograph. Judge Whitman leaned forward as she placed it on his bench. The image was grainy but clear, a dirt-covered backpack, small and pink. A name was stitched on the fabric. Sophie Calloway. The room erupted. Murmurs turned into shouts, journalists scrambling to scribble notes. Judge Whitman slammed his gavel down twice. "Order in the court!" His voice carried through the room, silencing the chaos. He turned back to Jenna. "Are you telling me that new evidence was recovered at this site just this morning?" "Yes, Your Honor." Jenna's voice was ice cold. "And there's more." She flipped to the next photograph. Tire tracks. "We ran an analysis of tire imprints found at the scene," Jenna continued. "The match? A vehicle owned by David Kent at the time of Sophie's disappearance." Another gasp. Jenna turned to the jury. Bella recognized Mr. Kent because she smelled him before. She smelled him at the crime scene of a missing girl, a girl who never made it home. All eyes turned to David Kentucky. And for the first time, his mask cracked. His hands clenched the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Michael Hartman, his lawyer, spoke through gritted teeth. Do not say a word." Kent's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. His breathing turned shallow. Judge Whitman turned to him, his voice measured but sharp. "Mr. Kent, do you have anything to say?" Silence. A long, damning silence. Jenna folded her arms. "Your Honor, we request that Mr. Kent be detained immediately while we continue our investigation." Judge Whitman nodded sharply. "The request is granted." A deputy moved forward. And for the first time in the entire trial, David Kent turned toward Bella. The dog did not move. She only stared at him, her eyes unwavering. Because she had known the truth long before anyone else. And now, the rest of the world did too. The courtroom was motionless, frozen in the weight of what had just been revealed. David Kent, the man who had walked into this trial with confidence, now sat slumped at the defense table, his fingers twitching against the polished wood. The evidence against him was undeniable. Bella had remembered him. She had remembered the scent of a missing child. And now, the jury had seen what that meant. Judge Harold Whitman looked down at the defendant, his face set like stone. "Mr. Kent," he said slowly, "you have the right to remain silent. But in this court, silence does not mean innocence." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The weight of the moment pressed against everyone's chest. Across the room, Emma Walker sat beside Bella, her small fingers woven into the dog's fur. She hadn't spoken throughout the trial. She hadn't needed to. Bella had done the speaking for her. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, his hands steady but his voice thick with something heavier than just duty. "Your Honor," he said, "we, the jury, find the defendant, David Kent, guilty on all counts." A collective breath was released in the room. Laura Walker, Emma's mother, closed her eyes, relief crashing over her in waves. David Kent sat unmoving. Then, finally, he let out a shaky breath. His shoulders slumped forward as if the weight of his own crimes had finally settled on him. Judge Whitman turned to him. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full weight of the law. "David Kent, you have been found guilty of attempted abduction and have now been linked to the disappearance of Sophie Calloway. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. The case was over. But the impact would last forever. As the courtroom began to clear, reporters rushed out, eager to be the first to tell the world how a dog helped solve a case that justice nearly lost. But in the midst of all the movement, one small moment stood still. Emma, still seated on the bench, turned toward Bella. For the first time since the trial began, she lifted her hand and touched the Labrador's face. She leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against Bella's. And in a voice so soft that only Bella could hear, she whispered, "Thank you." Bella's tail thumped once. Because she had done her job. She had kept her girl safe. And most importantly, she had made sure the world finally listened. The trial was over, but justice was only part of the battle. For Emma Walker, healing wasn't something that could be declared with the strike of a gavel. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't simple. It was a journey, one she would have to walk step by step. But she wouldn't be walking alone. Bella would be with her. It had been a week since the verdict. The news had spread far beyond San Francisco, headlines hailing the case as a landmark moment in justice. But inside the Walker home, things were quieter. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under the feet of neighborhood children. Their laughter carried through the open window, a sound that had once belonged to Emma. She sat on the back porch, Bella curled beside her. The Labrador's warm body pressed against her leg, steady and sure. Emma reached down, running her fingers along Bella's fur. For weeks, her hands had spoken when her voice could not. They had clung to Bella's leash in the courtroom, traced the dog's scar in the silence of the night. And now, in the stillness of the afternoon, they trembled, not with fear, but with something else. A quiet courage. A choice. Laura Walker stood near the kitchen door, watching her daughter from a distance. She had learned to give Emma space, to let her find her own way back. She had spent so many nights wondering if her little girl would ever smile again. And then, it happened. Soft. Small. But unmistakable. Emma's lips curled, the barest hint of a smile. Then, she opened her mouth. Her voice was quiet, like a forgotten melody finally remembered. "Bella," she said. Laura covered her mouth with both hands, her heart aching, her eyes burning. Bella lifted her head at the sound of her name. Her tail wagged, once, twice. And just like that, Emma's voice returned to the world. Not all at once. Not in full. But enough. Enough to say what needed to be said. Enough to begin again. Judge Harold Whitman visited the Walkers a few days later. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching as Emma played in the yard with Bella. "She's going to be okay," he said. Laura, standing beside him, nodded. "She is." Judge Whitman let out a slow breath, looking at the Labrador. "That dog did something none of us could do." Laura smiled softly. She listened. Whitman nodded. And she never stopped. Life moved forward. The seasons changed. David Kent faded into the past, locked away behind steel and concrete. But Bella stayed. Through every bedtime story. Through every shadow that still lurked in Emma's mind. Through every word that slowly, surely, found its way back. She stayed. Because a true guardian never leaves.